Thank you for joining me for another Todd Talk. We take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. Today is one in a series of videos on public speaking. And today, this one is specifically going to focus on something that's extremely important when it comes to public speaking, which is your voice. A lot of people think that your voice is the primary deliverer of your information when you're public speaking, but there are other things that also communicate, which we'll talk about in other videos. But your voice is really important. Your voice is what delivers the information that you have, it's what communicates the emotion that you want people to feel. The voice is really, really important when it comes to public speaking. One thing to remember about your voice, though, is a lot of times people are like, oh, you need to be consistent with things. Your voice should not be consistent. And here's why. Your voice is not consistent in real life. When you're talking with someone, you are having a conversation with someone, you are varying lots of things in your conversation to make it sound like a conversation. When you're consistent with your pace, with your tone, with your, all you sound like that, you sound like this because you're being very consistent and everything is the same. And it comes off sounding very monotone and you sound like a robot. You don't want to sound that way when you're giving a speech. So today I'm going to talk about 5 things that to consider when it comes to your voice. All 5 of them, when it comes to, they all have variants. In other words, there's not one way to do them. There's multiple ways to do them. And so you have to figure out what's the best way to do that. So, number 1 on this list is your inflection. So, inflection is how are you saying the words? How are you hitting the syllables? How are you, what emphasis are you putting on the words? And so, when it comes to inflection, again, you want to sound like you're having a conversation. You don't want to sound like you're reading words. You want to sound like you're speaking with someone. So I'll give you an example of what this might look like. And so I have another video on what the difference between reading and presenting, but I want to show, this is an example of a paragraph from the book Walden, and I'm going to read this with inflection. I have heard of a dog that barked at every stranger who approached his master's premises with clothes on, but was easily quieted by a naked thief. It is an interesting question how far men would retain their relative rank if they weren't divested of their clothes. Could you, in such a case, tell surely of any company of civilized men which belong to the most respected class? So you can see as I'm reading that, I am changing my inflection when I hit certain words. So if I were giving a speech and I was talking about something and I was really happy about that, my voice would go up. My inflection would go up because I'm trying to convey happiness. If I'm talking about something and it's sad, then my voice might go down. That inflection is going to change depending upon the emotion that I am trying to convey. If you stay consistent, the audience can't figure out what the emotion is, even when you say that with your words. So you got to make sure that inflection is there to let them to guide the audience on where you're going with this, what you want them to feel. The second is the idea of pace. And pace is just how fast you go, or slow for that matter. In a lot of cases, I see people talk too fast. And the reason being is that they're very nervous, their adrenaline is pumping, they're anxious. Just know that when you speak, you need to speak at a pace that people can keep up with, but not get lost. If you go too fast, people are playing catch up the entire time. If you go too slow, you risk, boring your audience. So you have to find kind of a middle ground when it comes to your pace. The pace I'm speaking right now is what I call my speaker's pace. It's much different than my conversational pace. When I'm talking with someone and I'm talking about a baseball game I watch or something I'm excited about, I would be talking at this pace. But I can't talk like that when I'm presenting. I need to make sure that my pace is clear and that people can keep up. So I set this as my baseline for my pace. And it sounds to me at times as though I'm talking in slow motion. And I've developed this over years of teaching in the classroom, giving lots of presentations. It is really important that I be understood. And one of the best ways to be understood is to go at a pace that people can follow. And so this is the baseline I've set. But then you can vary this pace. So what I mean by this is if I'm talking about something and it's a really exciting battle and something that happens the Civil War, I may get faster with my pace. If I'm talking about something that's really important, I might slow it down. So you vary that pace again for effect to try to get someone to experience something with your pace. So get them excited by speaking fast, get them to really listen by going slower. So you want to take that baseline pace and vary it depending upon the mood that you're trying to set. The third one I want to talk about is volume. Volume seems obvious. You need to be loud enough so that people can hear you. I have a louder voice. I call it my teacher voice. Whenever I'm with my wife, she'll say, "Can you use your teacher voice?" if she needs to get people quiet. So I have this voice I've developed over the years, and and this voice is loud enough to be heard, but it's not so loud that it's obnoxious. So you have to make sure that your volume is at such a volume that people aren't annoyed by your volume, but that they can hear you. Because I think even more annoying than a really loud person is someone I just can't hear. If you have a soft speaker, someone who talks so soft, you can't understand what they're saying. I struggle with that. So I want my speaker to project. I want my speaker to make sure that their volume is at an adequate level. Now, once you've set that volume, again, that baseline, you're going to vary your volume depending upon what you're going to do. So if you're really excited about something, you might get louder. But if you're really just introspective and thinking about something, you might get softer. Again, varying that baseline is where good speaking takes place by this variance. The fourth that I want to talk about is the idea of articulation. So when you're pronouncing words, you want to make sure as though you are pronouncing them correctly. So what you want to do is when you write your speech, you want to read it over out loud. And if you are stumbling on some words, either practice them so you no longer stumble or simply change the words. A lot of times people try to put big vocabulary in their speeches to try to impress people, and then they trip on that big vocabulary. So you're trying to impress people, but then you can't pronounce it correctly, and then you come off as being unprofessional. So you want to make sure that you use simple words that communicate. You also want to speak in the language of your audience. So you don't want to use vocabulary they don't know. You want to make sure this is common vocabulary that everyone would be aware of. And when you articulate, you are pronouncing the word as though you have confidence in what you're saying. I've seen people, well, they'll pronounce a word and they put a question mark on the end. They'll be, and the name of that was Lake Titicaca, and it's like it's a question. It shouldn't be a question when you're giving a speech. You should have confidence. You should be speaking with authority. And how you give off that authority is by sounding like you know what you're saying because you were speaking correctly. Another thing to consider when it comes to pronouncing is you want to make sure that you use your lips and your mouth a little bit more. So I'll give you a perfect example. Pronunciation is a tough word to say. So when I know I'm coming up on having to say that, I really get my mouth involved. So you can see my mouth is talking right now, but when I say pronunciation, it gets a little bit more so that I can clearly say it. So you have to make sure that you're aware of that. You also want to be confident in words that maybe you don't know how to pronounce. When I started out as a teacher, I was teaching about the Mesoamericans to my students in the history class that I taught. And the Mesoamericans have a lot of names that are spelled very differently than is common. There's lots of Q's, there's lots of Z's. And so I would come across someone and I would say Quetzalcoatl, and I would say it with confidence. And kids just were like, "Oh, that's how you pronounce it." And so, because I was confident, they believed that that was the way it was pronounced. I'm not even sure if that's the way it's supposed to be pronounced, but I certainly sounded like I had confidence in my pronunciation. So, have confidence as well, because this confidence then causes the audience to have that ethos. And ethos is that they think that you are someone who's reliable, that should be listened to. So if you come off as confident, they're going to believe you more, they're going to trust you more. And your pronunciation is one way that you can establish that. So, the fifth and last thing I want to talk about when it comes to your voice is the rhythm that you have when you're speaking the words. So there is a rhythm when you are speaking, much like a song has a rhythm, like poetry has a rhythm. And when you are speaking, you want to make sure that you use this rhythm. Typically, in the written form, this rhythm is established by grammar. So if you have a comma, you are making a slight pause. If you have a semicolon, the pause may be longer. If you have a period, you have a hard stop. So when we're reading a book, this grammar then establishes the rhythm that the author is trying to make. If you read a lot of poetry, grammar is so important in establishing the rhythm of that poetry. And so when you're giving a speech, you want to have a certain rhythm to it, but you have to figure out where to put in these pauses for effect. So if you pause for just a moment, it allows people to catch up and you can go further along. If you again get a hard stop, then people know that what you said was something probably pretty important. So this rhythm then also guides people to list for what to listen for. So I'm going to read a poem, one of my favorite poems. It's by Dylan Thomas. It's called "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night," and I'm going to use the commas and semicolons to kind of guide how I'm going to speak the poem. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild man, who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned, too late, they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men, near death, who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on his sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce scars, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So you can hear the pauses and the stops all create a rhythm. And the same goes when you're giving your speech. There's also something to be said about the power of the pause. Sometimes when we're speaking, we feel like we have to fill the air, that we have to always be speaking. But sometimes silence can have a very powerful effect. So if you're getting ready to start to talk about something really important and you're arriving to the crescendo, the climax of what you're talking about, a long pause is going to build up effect. So if I'm talking and I say, and the most important thing I want you to realize is that you should do this. And so that pause brings up that climax, it makes it more dramatic. And so you want to have this rhythm. So these five things are all things that need to be varied when you're speaking with your voice. And you vary them to fit the tone that you're trying to set. Keep in mind, when you are giving a speech, you're not just giving information, you're also trying to guide people how to feel. So, and this is what is known as pathos. And in pathos, you're trying to not only get people to think, which is the logos, you're trying to get them to feel something. And one excellent way to get folks to feel is to vary your voice, to make sure that when you're speaking, you are using your voice to create emotion, to create a feeling that your audience can latch onto and sets the mood and the tone for your piece.